and the steady pulse of jazz drifting up from a trumpet that refuses to sleep. You hear the slap of shoes on floorboards, the shuffle of skirts, and the sly laugh of someone who knows they've just broken a rule and gotten away with it. The world outside these walls is still one of horse-drawn memories and strict Sunday routines, but in here everything feels different, louder, faster, and just a little bit dangerous. You probably won't survive this if you're the sort who faints at the sight of someone showing her knees. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? And what time is it right now in your part of the world? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The 1920s don't just arrive with a polite knock. They burst through the door like a brass band. You trudge along the streets of a city, maybe New York, maybe Chicago, and every corner hums with the syncopated rhythm of jazz. Not the genteel kind of music your parents might have tapped their toes to, but something wilder, restless, almost cheeky. The clarinet squeals high, the bass plucks deep, and it makes you want to sway your shoulders no matter how tightly you clutch your coat. Traditional America, still stiff from Victorian corsets and Edwardian etiquette, reels at the sound. For years, life had been about following rules, polite visits, careful introductions, respectable dances, where the most daring move might be a waltz spin that left you briefly dizzy. Now, you stand in a basement where the music is so loud it feels like it rattles the bones inside your chest. One mainstream historical fact everyone agrees on: jazz clubs became the heartbeat of urban life. The music, rooted in African American traditions of New Orleans, traveled north during the Great Migration. And with it came not just rhythms, but an attitude. Jazz rejected the straight lines of old sheet music. It bent notes, stretched time, and celebrated improvisation. To traditionalists, it looked like chaos. To you listening right now, it feels like the first taste of freedom. And here's a quirky tidbit. Newspapers of the time actually described jazz as a disease. Some columnists warned it caused nervous disorders and moral weakness. Imagine sitting in a doctor's office where the prescription reads, "Avoid syncopation at all costs." You almost laugh, except that in small towns across America, people actually believed it. Historians still argue whether the moral panic was truly about the music, or whether jazz was simply the symbol of something bigger. A code word for women stepping outside their homes, for black culture entering white spaces, for the younger generation daring to move differently. You glance across the dance floor and spot them, the flappers. They don't glide or curtsy, they shimmy. Short hair bounces, sequins flash in the dim light, and there's no denying they terrify the old guard. You notice one lift her glass and smirk at a man watching too long. She isn't there to please him. She's there to enjoy herself. That tiny shift, living for her own pleasure instead of approval, is as seismic as any earthquake. The jazz age awakens America with contradictions. Ministers thunder against the devil's music on Sunday mornings, then sneak into clubs on Friday nights. Politicians enforce prohibition, yet police officers take bribes to let liquor trucks rumble through alleys. Everywhere you walk, you sense the tug of war. Restraint on one side, abandon on the other. And as you listen, you realize this isn't just music. It's the sound of a culture shifting, the sound of people learning that the world could be louder, freer, and scarier than anything their parents ever imagined. The flapper may not have arrived in full yet, but the stage is set, the bass is thumping, the saxophone is wailing, and America's heartbeat is speeding up. You follow the sound of laughter down a side street and duck into a barbershop that doesn't quite look like one. The familiar striped pole spins lazily outside, But the chairs inside aren't filled with men getting shaves. Instead, women line the mirrors, their long hair tumbling to the floor in heavy, glistening strands. You blink, are they really cutting it all off? Yes. The bob has arrived and America is gasping. Hair, of all things, becomes a battlefield. For centuries, long flowing locks were symbols of femininity, purity, and even virtue. A woman's hair was described as her crowning glory. Yet here in the 1920s you watch as flappers grin at their reflections while scissors slice through tradition. The neat, chin-length bob frames their faces in a way that says, "I choose who I am." One mainstream fact you can't escape. Barbershops suddenly found themselves swamped with female customers, since most beauty salons weren't yet trained or daring enough to chop hair so short. Newspapers reported lines of young women waiting, while bewildered older men muttered that civilization itself was being clipped away strand by strand. And here's your quirky tidbit. One small-town minister declared that bobbed hair was a mark of spiritual rebellion. He actually suggested that God would have trouble recognizing his daughters if they showed up in heaven with short hair. You imagine the line at the pearly gates, St. Peter squinting, saying, "Sorry, miss, we're only admitting long braids today." Historians still argue whether the bob was more than just a style. Was it a feminist declaration, a refusal to be weighed down by heavy pins and combs? Or was it simply a fashion fad, made popular by movie stars like Louise Brooks and then sold to millions of women by clever advertisers? You run your hand along the smooth edge of a fresh bob and wonder if both things can be true at once. To parents and grandparents, these sharp cuts felt like a slap in the face. You picture a mother standing over a sink, clutching the thick braid her daughter just discarded, weeping as though she'd lost more than hair. Family letters from the era actually describe daughters sneaking out to have their hair bobbed, then returning home wearing cloche hats to hide the deed until the shock could be softened. Yet to the young women themselves, the bob was intoxicating. It wasn't just lighter and cooler in the summer, it was rebellious. It looked fast, sharp, modern. It fit inside a driving cap when roaring down the street in a new Ford, and it bounced freely to the Charleston in smoky clubs. The bob told the world, "I'm not hiding behind heavy veils and old rules." As you linger in the barbershop, you notice something else. Lipstick tubes tucked in purses, powder compacts clinking against coins, perfume lingering in the air. It's not just hair. It's a whole new kit of self-presentation, each product daring women to take control of how they appear. And for every shocked father crossing his arms, there's a daughter smirking into the mirror, delighting in how light her head feels. One joke passes through the smoky air. What's the difference between a flapper and a boy? Answer: the flapper wears more rouge. It gets a chuckle, but behind the humour is unease. If women start to look different, act different, maybe even work and vote differently, where does that leave the old order? You step outside again and feel the autumn air on your neck, short hair brushing your collar. For a moment you understand why the bob became more than a haircut. It's a small rebellion you carry with you everywhere, even when the jazz fades and the speakeasy doors close. Each lock on the barbershop floor is another rule snipped away. You shuffle down a crowded city street and something catches your eye. It isn't the glow of neon lights or the clang of trolley cars, it's fabric. Skirts that once dragged along the floor now stop daringly high, floating above ankles and creeping higher still. You pause, startled, because for the first time you can actually see a knee. In 1923, that sight was enough to set tongues wagging faster than any scandal sheet. It sounds funny now, but remember, for most of the 19th century, even a glimpse of an ankle was considered racy. Grandmothers clucked about young ladies showing too much stocking as though civilization might topple with the flick of a hemline. Now here you are, in the thick of the 1920s, where hemlines rise season by season like a thermometer on a July afternoon. A mainstream historical fact everyone notes. Skirts climbed from floor length to calf length within just a few short years. By 1925, dresses often stopped at the knee, especially for evening wear. Fashion houses in Paris set the pace, and department stores in America eagerly followed. Women felt lighter, freer, able to actually move without tripping on fabric. And here's a quirky tidbit. One small-town newspaper in Kansas claimed that raised hemlines were responsible for a spike in pneumonia because women refused to wear proper covering during chilly winters. Imagine a doctor prescribing long skirts as medicine, as if silk chiffon could ward off the flu. Historians still argue whether short skirts were truly about liberation or just consumerism. Did women wear them to assert independence, or because fashion companies convinced them to buy new wardrobes every season? You imagine both forces tugging at the same hemline, freedom on one side, capitalism on the other. To conservative eyes, though, it was plain indecency. Church leaders condemned the naked knees that appeared at dance halls. One minister warned his congregation that short skirts were an invitation to sin, while women rolled their eyes and tugged hems even higher. Police in some cities actually patrolled beaches with rulers, measuring bathing suits to ensure no more than 6 inches of thigh showed. You can picture the absurd scene. An officer crouched in the sand, tape measure in hand, while bathers giggled and pretended to shiver. But to flappers, the rising skirt was practical as much as playful. How else could you kick up your heels to the Charleston without tripping over fabric? How else could you climb into a rumble seat on a joyride without a yard of lace tangling around your ankles? The knee became both a symbol and a tool, a little flash of skin that said, "I move how I want." Mothers fretted, of course. Letters from the time show women hiding their new dresses at friends' houses until the night of a dance, slipping them on only when they were safely away from parental eyes. Imagine the shock when a father came to pick up his daughter at midnight and found her dancing with her knees on full display. Still, the fashion caught fire. Department stores installed mirrors with better lighting so women could admire their legs. Hosiery sales boomed, since stockings were suddenly visible. Even shoe styles changed. Mary Janes and T-straps framed ankles once hidden. You realize this wasn't just about fabric. It was about a whole industry rising up along with the hemline. And in the end, every inch of exposed knee felt like another inch of freedom. You walk along the sidewalk, skirts swishing just above your calves, and hear the disapproving hiss of a passing matron. But you also catch the grin of another young woman across the street. She's daring too, and she knows the thrill of feeling the breeze where fabric used to weigh her down. You step into the smoky corner of a crowded cafe, and the first thing that hits you isn't the music or the chatter. It's the scent, a mix of coffee, alcohol, smuggled in undercoats, and the faint sweetness of tobacco. You blink as a woman at the next table raises a slim cigarette holder to her lips, inhales calmly, and exhales a perfect ribbon of smoke that drifts right into the disapproving glare of a man in a bowler hat. You almost laugh. She knows exactly what she's doing. Cigarettes, until now, had been the province of men. Proper ladies might sniff lavender sachets, but they didn't light up in public. That all changes in the 1920s. The cigarette becomes less a habit and more a statement. A mainstream historical fact tells you that Edward Bernays, the so-called father of public relations, ran a campaign in 1929 that branded cigarettes as torches of freedom. He hired women to march in New York's Easter parade, puffing away as a declaration of equality. You can imagine the gasps rippling down Fifth Avenue as smoke curled skyward like tiny acts of rebellion. And lipstick. Ah, the crimson slash across a face that used to be bare. Women had always dabbled in rouge, but to wear a bold red lip in public had long been considered scandalous, associated with actresses, courtesans, or fast women. Now you watch as flappers flip open shiny tubes of lipstick right at the table, painting their mouths unapologetically. For once they don't bother sneaking into powder rooms, they reapply in the open, daring anyone to object. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some cities tried to legislate against lipstick. In 1915, Kansas even considered a bill making it a misdemeanor for women under 44 to wear cosmetics for the purpose of creating a false impression. Imagine police wagging fingers at 23-year-olds for looking too good to be true. The law didn't pass, but the idea alone shows you how rattled traditional America was by painted faces. Historians still argue whether this explosion of cosmetics was about rebellion or about consumer manipulation. Was a red lip a battle cry or just the result of Max Factor and Elizabeth Arden knowing how to advertise? You picture a flapper leaning against a brick wall, her lipstick tube gleaming in the moonlight, and think, maybe it doesn't matter, it felt like freedom either way. Of course, the elders clucked their tongues. Etiquette books warned that painting one's face suggested dishonesty, as though rouge was a mask hiding a wicked soul. Mothers whispered that respectable men wouldn't marry girls who smoked or wore lipstick. But here you are, watching men sidle closer, offering to light cigarettes, sneaking glances at crimson lips. Respectability may have been trembling, but attraction certainly wasn't. One preacher thundered from his pulpit that smoking women would fill the nation with ashes. You grin at the image, clouds of flappers trailing smoke like locomotives, puffing defiantly down Main Street, while elders waved handkerchiefs in despair. And in the cafes, the mood is electric. Cigarettes pass from hand to hand, smoke rises to the ceiling, and a fresh coat of lipstick marks the rim of every glass. You run your finger over the smooth, lacquered case, realizing this isn't about nicotine or powder at all. It's about women being visible, unapologetic, present in spaces where they once had to remain silent. When you step back out into the night, the air feels different, thicker somehow, tinged with smoke and freedom. And you can't shake the image of those painted lips glowing like tiny lanterns in the dark, daring the old world to blink first. You push open a heavy, unmarked door tucked between a bakery and a tailor shop. At first glance, it looks like just another storage room, dim, dusty, and quiet. But then a panel in the back wall creaks open, and you're ushered down a narrow staircase. The muffled thump of music grows louder with each step. At the bottom, the air is warm, the lights are low, and a bartender slides a glass of bootleg gin across the counter as though you've stumbled into another world. Welcome to the speakeasy. The 1920s taught America a paradox. The more you ban something, the more thrilling it becomes. Prohibition, declared in 1920 with the 18th Amendment, was supposed to make the nation sober and moral. Instead, it spawned a vast underground of hidden bars, fake seltzer trucks, and bribed policemen. A mainstream historical fact. By the mid-1920s, New York alone boasted tens of thousands of speakeasies, more drinking establishments than had existed before Prohibition. You lean against the bar and watch the scene unfold. Men in tailored suits laugh too loudly, while women in sequins sip cocktails named things like bee's knees and sidecar. The drinks are rough, sometimes mixed with questionable alcohol that tastes more like paint thinner than gin. But no one here complains. The flavour isn't the point. The secrecy is intoxicating. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some speakeasies required elaborate passwords to enter, and others installed peepholes shaped like stars or hearts. In one Chicago club, You had to whisper the name of the owner's pet parrot to gain admission. Imagine a line of nervous partygoers mumbling "Polly" just to earn a sip of bathtub gin. Historians still argue whether speakeasies were primarily sites of liberation or exploitation. Were they places where women could finally socialize alongside men as equals? Or were they simply profit machines run by mobsters happy to sell watered-down whiskey to anyone with cash? Either way, you can't deny the cultural effect. In these smoky rooms, flappers danced shoulder to shoulder with businessmen, dissolving boundaries that once felt carved in stone. The music swells and you notice couples crowding onto a dance floor barely big enough for a card table. A clarinet squeals, a drum pounds, and women kick their legs high, skirts flying, beads clattering like rain. Somewhere in the corner, a moralist would faint at the sight, muttering about ruin and disgrace, but here nobody cares. The whole room moves as though it shares a single pulse. Prohibition agents sometimes raid these places, of course. You imagine the panic when the lights snap on, music cuts off, and everyone scrambles for the hidden exit. Yet even those raids feed the allure. Being caught feels less like shame and more like proof that you've truly lived. The next night people return in greater numbers, ready to laugh and drink all over again. You slip into a booth where two women share a flask, giggling. One smears her lipstick on the rim of the glass and shrugs. "No use crying over gin," she says, handing it back to her friend. That small exchange says more than any speech. They're here because they want to be, not because anyone gave them permission. As the night drifts toward morning, you climb the stairs again and step out into the cool city air. Behind you, the door clicks shut, sealing in the music and laughter. On the street, the world looks ordinary. Delivery wagons rattling past, a policeman whistling at the corner. But you carry with you the memory of what you just saw, a generation rewriting the rules underground, one smoky toast at a time. The night doesn't end when the bar closes. Instead, you follow a trail of laughter into a grand ballroom, its floorboards slick with wax, chandeliers dripping golden light, and a live band exploding with syncopation. The first blast of trumpet rattles your chest, and before you know it, you're swept into a wave of limbs and laughter. The Charleston has arrived, and suddenly every respectable waltz looks like something from a nursing home. The Charleston is wild. You kick one leg forward, swing the other behind, flap your arms like you're about to take flight. Shoes slap, beads clatter, and skirts swirl as women bend their knees and fling themselves around with a freedom that feels reckless. One mainstream historical fact: the dance burst onto the national stage after appearing in the 1923 Broadway musical Running Wild. Within a year, it swept across America like wildfire, infecting ballrooms, backyards, and even respectable parlors with its infectious rhythm. And here's your quirky tidbit. In some hotels, signs went up banning the Charleston because it was too hard on the floors. Imagine management complaining that the knees and ankles of guests weren't the problem. Those stomping shoes were wrecking the expensive parquet. Historians still argue whether the Charleston was just innocent fun or a coded rebellion. Was it simply a new dance craze like the Macarena of its time, or was it a deliberate mockery of stiff Victorian decorum? Some even trace its roots to African-American dance traditions from Charleston, South Carolina, giving the whole craze an edge of cultural defiance that conservative America found even more threatening. You lean against the wall, catching your breath, and watch as young women fling themselves with abandon. Their dresses are cut short, so their knees flash in time with the beat. No corset pins them down, no chaperone hovers at the edge. A flapper locks eyes with you, smirks, and spins in a dizzy whirl, daring the entire room to keep up. Of course, the moralists fumed. A priest in Boston declared the Charleston a menace to the souls of youth. Etiquette manuals warned that flailing legs might kick unsuspecting partners in unseemly places. One minister claimed the dance led directly to moral collapse. You can almost hear him clutching his pearls while teenagers down the block twisted and laughed under a street lamp. The humour of it all is irresistible. Imagine the same parents who once fainted at a foxtrot now watching their daughters sweat through stockings as they stomped the Charleston into the floor. It wasn't elegant, but it was electric, and like all great rebellions, it spread fast. Dance marathons sprang up, testing how long couples could Charleston without collapsing. Some lasted days, the exhausted contestants fueled by coffee, adrenaline, and sheer stubbornness. Prizes ranged from cash to a new set of tires, proof that even commercial America couldn't resist turning rebellion into marketing. As you sway along with the band, you realize the Charleston isn't just a dance, it's a declaration. It says, we won't sit quietly in the corner anymore. We'll sweat, stomp, laugh, and move until the floor shakes. Every kick of a flapper's leg feels like a nail in the coffin of Victorian restraint. By the time the music fades, you're dizzy, your shoes scuffed, and your sides aching with laughter. Yet you know this is only the beginning. Tomorrow, the moralists will lecture again, the newspapers will complain, and the hotel managers will wince at broken floorboards. But tonight, you've witnessed America learning to move in ways it never dared before. You stumble out of the dance hall, hair damp with sweat and shoes aching from the Charleston, but the night isn't over yet. You duck into a powder room, and there it is, a small army of women gathered around the mirror, not to tidy stray curls or adjust corsets, but to paint. Powder, rouge, and kohl fly across the counter like tools of an artist's studio. You watch as one young woman tilts her chin up, dusts her cheeks pale, then dabs a circle of crimson onto her lips. It isn't subtle. It isn't meant to be. This is war paint, and the battlefield is society's expectations. For centuries, respectable women were warned away from cosmetics. Makeup belonged to actresses, courtesans, or, whisper it, women of ill repute. Yet here in the 1920s, the flapper declares the powder compact as essential as her keys. A mainstream historical fact, the portable compact itself became wildly popular thanks to companies like Coty and Max Factor, who made them affordable and stylish. What once required a dressing table now fit neatly inside a beaded purse, ready for touch-ups anywhere from a cafe table to the back seat of a car. Here's your quirky tidbit. Etiquette experts were scandalized by women reapplying powder in public. It was seen as indecent as undressing. One columnist in 1925 huffed that a lady might as well bathe in the street. You picture flappers laughing, flipping open their compacts and puffing powder just to watch the elders sputter. Historians still argue whether cosmetics represented liberation or entrapment. Were flappers boldly seizing control of their image, or were they simply falling for the shiny promises of advertising that told them beauty could be bought? The truth, as usual, lies somewhere in the smudge between eyeliner strokes. You lean closer to the mirror and see the artistry unfold. Eyebrows are penciled into dramatic arches, eyes rimmed with kohl so they look wide and sultry under smoky club lights. Rouge is dabbed on cheeks in little circles, deliberately artificial, almost mocking the idea of natural beauty. The effect is theatrical, unapologetic, and impossible to ignore. Older women hissed that it was vulgar. Some even claimed makeup was a trap to lure innocent men. One preacher insisted painted lips were the devil's calling cards. But you notice men lining up anyway, eager to dance with these painted rebels. If lipstick was a trap, it was one the men fell into willingly. A young woman beside you snaps her compact shut with a click, slides it into her beaded purse, and grins. "There," she says, Now I look how I feel. That phrase lingers. Makeup isn't just camouflage, it's expression. It tells the world, I choose the colors of my own face. The flapper steps out of the powder room and back into the dance, leaving a faint cloud of perfumed powder in her wake. You follow, realizing you've just witnessed something small but seismic. Every brushstroke, every crimson lip, every public dab of powder is a rebellion against the rule that women should fade quietly into the background. And as the band strikes up again, you can't help but smile. Tonight, rouge isn't a scandal, it's a badge of freedom. The night stretches into dawn and you find yourself not in a dance hall this time, but rattling along the open road. The hum of an engine replaces the thump of jazz drums, and the flapper in the driver's seat grins with both hands on the wheel, scarf whipping in the wind. Automobiles, once slow luxuries for gentlemen in top hats, have become freedom machines for young women who refuse to wait at home for someone else to chauffeur them. A mainstream historical fact. By the mid-1920s, Ford's Model T had become affordable enough that middle-class families, and even single women, could buy one. Suddenly, the automobile wasn't just for business or family errands, it was for joyrides, road trips, and stolen kisses under starlight. To flappers, a car wasn't metal and rubber, it was independence on four wheels. And here's your quirky tidbit. Newspapers of the time carried dozens of complaints about reckless girl drivers. One, my 1924 letter to the editor, claimed that bob-haired girls behind the wheel were the gravest menace to our highways. The writer suggested, half seriously, that women should be banned from driving unless accompanied by a male guardian. You picture a flapper tossing her cigarette out the window and muttering, "Catch me if you can." Historians still argue whether the car was truly liberating for women or simply reinforced new expectations. Did driving empower them, or did it pressure them to join the consumer culture of road trips, diners, and roadside advertising? Either way, you can't deny that the image of a flapper behind the wheel unsettled traditional America. A woman who could drive herself could also decide where to go, who to see, and when to come home. That was frightening for fathers who had always held the keys. The scene feels cinematic. A young woman clutches the wheel with one gloved hand, shifts gears with the other, and takes a curve far too fast. The car jolts, passengers squeal, but she laughs with wild abandon. Her bobbed hair flutters, her beaded dress sparkles in the morning sun, and for a moment you understand why the automobile terrified parents even more than lipstick or short skirts. Out on Lover's Lane, cars become rolling chaperone-free zones. Couples sit in the front seats, radio crackling faintly, conversations drifting from dreams to stolen kisses. The very structure of dating changes because suddenly the parlor isn't the only stage. Privacy, once impossible for respectable young couples, is now parked under a tree with headlights dimmed. Mothers wring their hands. Fathers grumble that cars are houses of sin on wheels. Yet the more they complain, the more the cars sell. Automobile companies even target women in ads, showing them behind the wheel with slogans like, "Every woman needs her own car." One preacher thundered that girls in automobiles will be the ruin of civilization. You can't help but chuckle. Civilization seems to be constantly on the brink of ruin in the 1920s, whether from knees, rouge, or gasoline. You lean back in the rumble seat, wind biting your cheeks, and realize the road stretches endlessly ahead. For flappers, every mile driven is another mile away from Victorian restraint. The car doesn't just take them places, it takes them away. Morning slides into afternoon, and instead of smoky clubs or roaring cars, you find yourself in the hushed halls of a university. The chalk squeaks faintly on a blackboard. The musty smell of old books lingers in the air, and rows of students bend over their notes. But look closely. There's something different here. Women, once kept to finishing schools and piano lessons, now fill the lecture benches. Some wear cloche hats, some lean back with cigarettes tucked in notebooks, and all of them look determined to claim their place. A mainstream historical fact. By the mid-1920s, women made up nearly 40% of college students in the United States. Enrollment boomed after World War I as more families considered higher education not just for sons, but for daughters. Universities that had once barred women began opening their doors, grudgingly or otherwise. What was once rare, a young woman debating politics in a lecture hall, now became common enough to rattle the old guard. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some professors complained that young women wore their short skirts too distracting for male classmates. One even suggested that co-eds sit in the back rows to avoid interfering with serious scholarship. You imagine a flapper twirling her pencil in the front row, smirking as she raises her hand just to irritate him. Historians still argue whether these college women were radical pioneers or simply a privileged minority. Were they blazing trails for all women, or just for those wealthy enough to afford tuition? Yet, as you sit among them, you sense a shift. These women don't see themselves as exceptions. They see themselves as the future. The campus culture transforms along with enrollment. Sororities swell, dances spill out of dormitories, and flappers bring jazz records into study halls. Professors sigh about declining seriousness, but students know that learning doesn't happen only in libraries. They debate women's rights, prohibition, art, literature, even Freud's strange new theories about the unconscious. The very air feels electric, as though each conversation is another spark toward a different America. And of course there are dates. With more women on campus, the ritual of pairing off shifts dramatically. Gone are the rigid, chaperoned teas. Now, students slip out for soda fountain meetups, joyrides, and late-night study sessions that might involve more laughter than Latin. College girls dance, drink, and experiment in ways their mothers never dreamed possible. Parents at home are bewildered. Letters from the 1920s show mothers begging daughters not to lose their virtue to books and boys. Fathers worried that higher education would make women unmarriageable by filling their heads with too many ideas. Yet those same daughters kept writing essays, passing exams, and lighting cigarettes after class, determined not to shrink back into the parlor. You picture one young woman closing her textbook with a snap, glancing around at her classmates. She's tired from studying, yes, but she's also alive with possibility. Tomorrow she might march into an office, or a classroom, or maybe even a courtroom. For the first time, the future feels like hers to claim. As you walk across the campus lawn, autumn leaves crunching underfoot, you realize you're standing in the middle of a revolution, though the world outside still doesn't know it yet. The flapper isn't just a dancer or a partygoer, she's also a student, reshaping the very definition of education and ambition. And that, more than anything, terrifies traditional America. You wander from the campus library into the crisp evening, but instead of heading home to a parlor with watchful parents, you trail behind a pair of students, slipping away down a quiet street. They laugh softly, arms brushing, the glow of a street lamp catching on her bobbed hair and his pressed collar. And then it dawns on you, there's no chaperone trailing them, no stern aunt clicking her knitting needles in the corner, no older brother clearing his throat. This is something new, love without a watchful eye. For centuries, courtship had been a supervised ritual. Families arranged meetings, parlors staged polite conversations, and a kiss might be postponed until after an engagement. Yet here in the 1920s, young couples rewrite the script, a mainstream historical fact. By this decade, the tradition of the calling card visit, where a young man was invited into a family parlour under strict observation, was fading fast. In its place, the notion of going out took root, with couples meeting in public spaces, free from hovering parents. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some etiquette books scrambled to catch up, publishing anxious advice on how many sodas a girl could accept from a boy before she seemed too forward. One suggested that if she let a young man buy her more than 3 drinks in one evening, she risked ruining her reputation. You can almost hear the flapper's laughter fizzing louder than the soda itself. Historians still argue whether this shift was driven more by women's independence or by urban anonymity. Was it the flapper's boldness that made unsupervised dating possible, or the sheer size of cities where parents simply couldn't monitor every stroll? Whatever the cause, you can see the result right here. 2 young people leaning against a shop window, smiling shyly, daring to carve out a space just for themselves. The automobile, of course, accelerates this freedom. No more parlour lights and family portraits looming overhead. Now couples park along quiet roads, inventing a new form of privacy. Critics howl about petting parties, the horror of lipstick-stained collars and the erosion of morals. Yet the thrill of being unobserved proves irresistible. You watch the girl adjust her cloche hat, her laughter bubbling into the night as she links arms with her date. There's no sense of scandal in her demeanour, only joy, only the relief of living in a time when choice feels possible. Parents predictably panic. Mothers write desperate letters warning daughters about fast reputations. Fathers complain that without chaperones, boys will take liberties. And yet those same parents often met their own spouses under the new system, proving how quickly panic becomes tradition. You can't help but smile at the irony. What horrified elders in 1922 would look quaint by 1942. Love without a chaperone was scandalous, then acceptable, then expected. Every soft laugh you overhear tonight is part of that slow cultural shift. As the couple strolls away, their shadows stretching long on the sidewalk, you sense the quiet rebellion in their footsteps. It isn't loud like the Charleston or smoky like the Speakeasy. It's quieter, gentler, but no less terrifying to a world built on supervision and control. And in that silence, you feel the true weight of change, the freedom to love on one's own terms. You linger at the corner, watching another pair of young people hurry past, and it strikes you, this new ritual doesn't even have a proper name yet. A few years ago, a young man would have said he was calling on a young lady, as though he were making a business visit, but now he says he's going out with her. And there, tucked neatly into 2 words, lies the invention of something huge: dating. A mainstream historical fact. The word date, as we know it, emerged in the early 20th century, but by the 1920s it had entered the mainstream. No longer just about courtship in parlours, dating was about going places: movies, soda fountains, dance halls. The entire rhythm of romance changed because suddenly it was public, casual, and repeatable. A boy could date one girl on Monday, another on Thursday, without being betrothed to either. Scandalous, right? Or, depending on your perspective, liberating. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some newspapers ran cartoons mocking the new serial data. One 1925 gag strip shows a young man keeping a ledger of expenses, sighing over the high cost of treating multiple girls to sodas. The joke was that love had become a financial burden, not a moral one. You chuckle at the image of Cupid sending receipts. Historians still argue whether dating was truly romantic freedom or just a transaction. Was it about choosing partners, or about consumer culture, teaching men to buy dinners and women to dress for the part? The debate lingers, much like the taste of a sweet cherry phosphate at the corner soda shop. You slip into one of those shops now, the clink of glasses and hiss of carbonation filling the air. Couples crowd into booths, giggling over straws, their knees bumping under the table. No stern mother hovers, no father coughs in warning. Just two people testing each other's humor, patience, and perhaps kissing potential. It looks so ordinary to your eyes now, but in the 1920s it was a social revolution bubbling up with the soda fizz. Dating reshaped expectations of romance. Instead of families engineering unions, young people began to shop around, some weighing charm, humor, and chemistry. The entire vocabulary of love expanded. Double dates, blind dates, even the dreaded standing someone up. Parents grumbled that it all looked unserious, but the flapper's grin said otherwise. She wasn't hunting for approval, she was hunting for fun, and maybe a partner who respected her as much as he admired her lipstick. You picture one girl leaning across the booth, straw tapping her teeth, asking her date what he thinks about jazz or politics. She's not waiting quietly, she's steering the conversation. That, too, terrifies traditional America, women who don't just listen, but lead. Of course, not everyone approved. Some commentators wailed that dating encouraged loose morals and reduced romance to a marketplace. Yet as you look around the soda shop, you see mostly laughter, clumsy jokes, and shy smiles. Hardly the downfall of civilization, unless civilization was very fragile indeed. As the evening winds down, couples drift out of the shop, hand in hand, heading for movies, dances, or maybe just a long walk. The word date has stuck, and with it, a whole new way of imagining love. For flappers, the thrill wasn't just in the company, it was in the freedom to choose, to leave, to try again. And that freedom, simple as it looks, is what made parents lose sleep at night. The soda shop empties, the neon hum fades, and you wander into a corner newsstand. Glossy covers shout at you from the racks, their bold colors and smiling faces impossible to ignore. Here are the new Bibles of the flapper generation, magazines that tell you what to wear, how to dance, what shade of lipstick makes your lips kissable, and even how to flirt without looking like you're trying. You flip one open, and suddenly you're not just reading advice, you're watching a revolution marketed in ink. A mainstream historical fact, the 1920s saw the rise of mass circulation magazines like Ladies' Home Journal, Photoplay, and Vogue, each peddling the flapper image. These weren't dusty household manuals like those your grandmother kept by the sewing basket. They were glossy, modern, and dripping with advertisements that equated freedom with fashion. A new short skirt wasn't just fabric, it was a lifestyle. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some of the earliest dating advice columns appeared in these pages, offering gems like always let him order the dessert or don't laugh too loudly, it makes you look common. Imagine a young woman reading that while practicing her Charleston kicks in front of a mirror. The gap between advice and reality was wide enough to drive a Model T through. Historians still argue whether these magazines empowered women or exploited them. Were they teaching independence or just trapping readers in a new consumer cycle? One side insists that glossy covers gave women role models. The other says they turned women into walking billboards for cosmetics and clothes. You picture a flapper closing her magazine with a shrug, then heading out the door to do whatever she wanted anyway. Inside the pages, movie stars beamed with bobbed hair and Cupid bow lips. Clara Bow, the it girl, leaned across advertisements for rouge and stockings, while writers spun tales of glamorous lives in New York and Paris. Suddenly, a farm girl in Kansas could flip through a magazine and imagine herself at a jazz club on Broadway. The magazines shrank the world, turning distant fantasies into reachable goals, or at least purchasable ones. Parents complained bitterly. One mother wrote to Ladies' Home Journal demanding that they stop encouraging young women to behave like actresses. Ministers thundered that the magazines poisoned virtue with glossy lies. And yet, subscriptions soared because every issue felt like a ticket to modernity. You stand at the newsstand, pages fluttering in your hands. The ads don't just sell powder, they sell confidence. They don't just sell stockings, they sell legs that deserve to be seen. They don't just sell magazines, they sell an identity. The flapper as modern woman, bold and unashamed. It's a clever trick, really. Consumer culture and rebellion walk hand in hand. You might not be able to sneak into a speakeasy or race down a highway, but you can buy lipstick, a cloche hat, and a magazine that whispers, "You belong to this new world too." As you place the magazine back on the rack, you realize the irony. The flapper terrified traditional America not just because of what she did in smoky clubs, but because her image could travel into every living room by mail. Even the most rural, rule-bound household couldn't keep her out once the postman delivered the glossy gospel. You tuck the magazine under your arm, wander into a darkened theatre, and suddenly the flapper steps off the page and onto the silver screen. The projector whirs, light flickers, and there she is, Clara Bow, the it girl. She struts across the screen with wide, laughing eyes and lips curved in a mischievous smile, a star who seemed to carry the very spirit of the decade in her stride. A mainstream historical fact. Clara Bow became the ultimate embodiment of the flapper in the 1920s. Her role in the 1927 film had earned her the nickname, and suddenly every girl wanted it. That intangible quality of charm, confidence and sex appeal. Movie houses filled with eager audiences who gasped at her daring on-screen and then copied her style off-screen. Here's your quirky tidbit. Bow's Brooklyn accent was so thick that studio executives once worried talkies would ruin her career. But during the silent era, it didn't matter. Her eyes did the talking, and her laugh carried more rebellion than 1,000 carefully written intertitles. Historians still argue whether stars like Bow liberated women or simply packaged rebellion for mass consumption. Was she a symbol of independence or a studio-crafted fantasy designed to sell tickets and rouge? Whatever the answer, the effect was undeniable. Young women bobbed their hair, painted their lips, and learned to tilt their heads just so, all in imitation of a woman they'd never meet, but felt they knew. You glance around the theatre. Girls whisper about Clara's latest dress, boys chuckle nervously at her boldness, and mothers sit stiffly in their seats, wishing the screen would burn itself out. The power of Hollywood is clear. One star can terrify traditional America by showing its daughters a new way to live. And it wasn't just Bow. Stars like Colleen Moore and Louise Brooks added to the flapper mystique, each bringing their own variation, sweet, sultry, sly. Every flickering frame challenged the older generation's notion of womanhood. A daughter who once dreamed of marriage now dreamed of Paris, nightclubs, or even stardom. One preacher famously warned his congregation that movie theaters were gateways to hell, where young women learned wickedness from the silver screen. You can almost hear the flappers giggling as they filed back into line for another matinee. The funny part is how ordinary the rebellion looks. A girl tilts her hat like Clara, another cuts her bangs like Louise, and suddenly she isn't just a daughter anymore, she's a participant in a cultural shift. No lecture, no rulebook, no scolding glare could compete with the magic of 20 feet of glowing film. As you step back into daylight, the glamour lingers. You know the it girl wasn't just a movie character. She was a spark that lit 1,000 small rebellions across America. And each flicker of film reel made the flapper feel a little less like a scandal and a little more like destiny. You wander away from the movie theatre, the glow of Clara Bow still lingering, and hear the faint strains of a phonograph spilling from a dance hall. But tonight, the date is Sunday, and that makes the sound even more shocking. You step closer, peek through the doorway and watch as couples whirl across the floor to a jazz band in full swing. It's the Sabbath, yet the Charleston roars on as if the commandments had never mentioned rest. A mainstream historical fact. In the 1920s, dancing on Sundays was a lightning rod for moral outrage. In cities like Boston and New York, blue laws attempted to restrict public amusements on the Sabbath, while young people simply ignored them. Jazz halls and ballrooms brimmed with dancers, turning what was supposed to be a day of solemnity into yet another night of rebellion. And here's your quirky tidbit. In some towns, police literally raided dance halls on Sunday evenings, hauling couples off the floor mid-step. One flustered mayor even proposed a dance tax to discourage the practice, arguing that if he couldn't stop the Charleston, at least he could make a profit from it. You imagine dancers fumbling for nickels in their stockings just to finish a foxtrot. Historians still argue whether Sunday dances represented genuine defiance or simple convenience. Were flappers deliberately mocking religion, or were they just seizing an extra night to blow off steam after long work weeks? Either way, you sense that the clash wasn't really about the day. It was about the freedom to decide when joy was allowed. Inside the hall, the scene is electric. Women in short skirts kick their legs high, men twirl them with abandon, and the music crashes against stained glass windows like a storm tide. Outside, ministers shake their fists, insisting that souls are at risk. Inside, sweat drips, laughter echoes, and nobody looks particularly damned. One minister thundered that Sunday dancers are waltzing straight into hell. You grin at the image, an endless line of flappers shimmying down to the underworld, sequins glittering in the firelight, while demons tap their pitchforks to the beat. Not exactly the sermon he intended, but certainly more memorable. Parents fretted too. Letters to newspapers fretted that daughters were losing their respectability by dancing on holy days. Yet for flappers, that was precisely the point. Respectability had become a straitjacket, and Sunday night was just another chance to shrug it off. You step inside, feel the wooden floor shudder beneath your feet, and realize how intoxicating it must have been. To dance on Sunday wasn't just fun, it was symbolic. It said, my body, my time, my joy. And that simple claim was enough to terrify traditional America, still clutching its hymnals while the jazz bled through the church walls. By the time the music fades and couples drift into the cool night air, you sense the victory. The Sabbath hasn't collapsed, the world hasn't ended, but something irreversible has shifted. Joy no longer asks permission, and rebellion doesn't take a day off. You step back into the alley, expecting quiet after the raucous Sunday dance, but instead you hear laughter echoing from the back of a smoky club. You follow the sound, and there they are. Flappers in beaded dresses perched on bar stools, their sequins catching candlelight, while men in sharp suits lean close. And lurking just beyond the glow in the shadows, you catch sight of the real power behind it all. The mobsters. A mainstream historical fact. Organized crime thrived in the 1920s precisely because of prohibition. Figures like Al Capone in Chicago and Arnold Rothstein in New York controlled vast networks of bootlegging, speakeasies, and gambling, and wherever the gin flowed, flappers danced. The underworld and the new woman were strange bedfellows, joined by the ban on alcohol and the thrill of defiance. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some mobsters actually hired flappers to pose as club hostesses, their very presence making establishments appear more glamorous and modern. In New York, one notorious speakeasy advertised flapper nights, encouraging women to drink for free just to lure in paying male customers. The sight of cigarette smoke curling from a bob-haired silhouette wasn't just rebellion, it was marketing. Historians still argue whether flappers were complicit in glamorizing crime or merely passengers in a system they didn't control? Did their presence prop up mob profits, or did they simply take advantage of spaces that finally welcomed them? The debate lingers like cigar smoke on a velvet curtain. You slide into a booth and watch the transactions unfold. A flapper clinks glasses with a man whose pinky ring gleams under the lamp. A violin scrapes a mournful tune in the corner. Behind the bar, cash changes hands, and a back door creaks open to admit crates of illicit whiskey. In these dim rooms, women sit shoulder to shoulder with crime bosses, laughing louder than the gunmen who guard the door. Of course, traditional America panicked. Newspapers screamed about girls gone wrong, warning that flappers consorting with gangsters would meet ruin. One columnist lamented that daughters of good families were being corrupted by bootleg gin and smooth-talking racketeers. You can almost see a mother fainting at the thought of her child sipping champagne poured by a man wanted for murder. And yet the allure was undeniable. Crime had style in the 1920s. Flappers weren't just dancing. They were performing rebellion on a stage paid for by mob money. The contrast was too delicious. While ministers scolded from pulpits, young women toasted under chandeliers stolen from old theatres. A joke floated around Chicago speakeasies. What's the difference between a flapper and a gangster? One wears beads, the other beats. It was dark humour, but it captured the odd companionship of danger and glamour. You take a sip of contraband gin and feel its harsh burn in your throat. The flapper beside you doesn't flinch. She laughs, clinks a glass against yours and says, "Here's to living fast." And for a moment, you believe her. When you finally step out into the night, the air feels sharp with both risk and freedom. You realize that flappers terrified traditional America not only because of what they wore or how they danced, but because they weren't afraid to sit at the same table as the underworld and toast to a life without rules. You wake the next morning with the faint taste of gin still clinging to your tongue, and the headlines on the newsstand hit you like a hangover. Bootleg dens raided, young girls in speakeasies, moral decline sweeps the nation. But the irony couldn't be thicker. The very law that was supposed to save America's soul, prohibition, had created the perfect playground for the flapper. A mainstream historical fact, the 18th Amendment, ratified in 1919 and enforced beginning in 1920, outlawed the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol. The intent was noble, or at least self-righteous. Reformers believed banning booze would reduce crime, strengthen families, and restore moral order. Instead, crime rates soared, bootleggers thrived, and Americans drank more recklessly than ever. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some flappers didn't just drink, they wore their liquor. One fad involved hollowed-out canes or garters fitted with tiny flasks. Imagine slipping gin from a thigh holster mid-Charleston, the beads of your dress jangling in time with your secret stash. It was both rebellion and comedy, like a magic trick performed at society's expense. Historians still argue whether prohibition fueled women's liberation or merely gave it a louder soundtrack. Did the ban create opportunities for women to step into spaces once barred to them? Or were flappers simply swept along in the current of a failed experiment? Either way, the connection was undeniable. No alcohol ban, no speakeasy culture, no flapper as we know her. You step into a crowded club that reeks of bathtub gin and cigarette smoke. A flapper tosses her head back, lipstick flashing as she downs a glass in one gulp. She isn't sipping sherry politely in a parlour. She's drinking like the men around her, laughing when it burns, and ordering another. It's less about the taste, which is often awful, and more about the act itself, public proof that she can do what was once forbidden. Older generations were horrified. One Kansas newspaper warned that A girl with gin on her breath is a menace to the Republic. Preachers thundered that women's livers would shrivel and their souls along with them. Yet the more they scolded, the more flappers raised their glasses. Nothing tastes sweeter than defiance. The scene is ridiculous and intoxicating at once. Bootleggers slip through alleys with bottles hidden under loaves of bread. Policemen take bribes with one hand while sipping whiskey with the other, and young women paint their lips scarlet before ducking through hidden doors. It's chaos wrapped in sequins, and it terrifies those who thought a simple ban could preserve the old world. One joke of the era goes like this: prohibition is better than no liquor at all. It gets a knowing laugh, especially from the flapper at your elbow, who winks as she tucks a silver flask back into her garter. By the time you stumble into the cool night, you realize prohibition wasn't about alcohol at all. It was about control and the refusal to be controlled. For flappers, every sip of gin was a toast to independence, every smoky laugh a declaration that the old rules no longer applied. You leave the city's smoky clubs behind and ride a train into the countryside, where the rhythm slows and the air smells faintly of hay and wood smoke. Here, the brick skyscrapers give way to clapboard houses and church steeples, but the shock waves of the flapper still ripple through every dusty street. In small-town America, the bobbed haircut, the rising hemline, and the painted lips land like scandalous grenades. A mainstream historical fact. The 1920s saw a widening cultural gap between urban and rural America. Cities embraced jazz, speakeasies, and modern fashion, while small towns clung tightly to church socials, farm routines, and Victorian ideals. Journalists of the era even described the cultural civil war between the modernists and traditionalists, a battle not of weapons, but of ideas and appearances. And here's your quirky tidbit. One Iowa newspaper actually reported on a town council meeting where members debated banning silk stockings because the sight of bare knees through sheer fabric was corrupting farm boys. Imagine a mayor holding up a stocking like it was contraband, his face redder than the rouge he so despised. Historians still argue whether the flapper truly penetrated small-town life or remained a city phenomenon. Some evidence suggests rural girls cut their hair and snuck lipstick in their sewing kits. Others say the image was exaggerated by city journalists hungry for a story. Either way, the tension was real. Letters to editors poured in from distraught parents who swore their daughters were imitating city harlots after spending just one summer in Chicago. You stroll past a whitewashed church and overhear two matrons whispering about the Johnson girl down the street. "She cut her hair," one gasps, "and wore rouge to the barn dance." The other shakes her head gravely, as though the fate of civilization itself teeters on a powder compact. You almost want to laugh. If rouge and bobs could topple the nation, maybe it wasn't that sturdy to begin with. Still, the disapproval runs deep. In small towns, reputations matter more than skyscrapers. A girl caught smoking on Main Street might be whispered about for years. Ministers thunder louder here than in the city, warning that jazz records and lipstick are Satan's new weapons. Parents threaten to lock their daughters indoors, though most sneak out anyway. The scent of powder still clinging to their collars. One flapper you meet leans against a fence post, hat tipped low, and shrugs. They'll talk no matter what. Might as well give them something to talk about. She smokes with a grin, her bobbed hair glowing copper in the sun, while the preacher across the street nearly drops his Bible. You realize then that the terror wasn't just about fashion or music. It was about small towns realizing their grip was slipping. Daughters weren't waiting for permission, and sons were eager to join them. The city wasn't just far away, it was arriving by train, in magazines, and in every scandalous laugh drifting through the quiet lanes. As you walk back toward the depot, the church bells toll, as steady as they've always been. But beneath their chime, you hear the faint echo of jazz carried by the wind from a girl's phonograph in her upstairs bedroom. The flapper has arrived in the countryside, whether anyone is ready or not. You leave the quiet farm lanes behind and step into a humming city office building, the clatter of typewriters echoing down the halls. The air smells of ink and carbon paper, the rhythm of work punctuated by the ring of telephones. And look there, rows of young women in crisp blouses, fingers flying over keys, eyes darting toward the clock. These aren't daughters confined to parlours, these are secretaries, stenographers, and teachers earning their own paychecks. And many of them, after hours, are flappers. A mainstream historical fact. By the 1920s, millions of American women worked outside the home, often as clerks, typists, teachers, or telephone operators. These jobs weren't glamorous, but they provided steady income and, most important, freedom from total dependence on fathers or husbands. The paycheck, modest as it might be, allowed women to buy their own dresses, their own lipstick, even their own cocktails at a speakeasy. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some school boards actually tried to ban teachers from bobbing their hair or wearing short skirts, fearing that students would be led astray. One Indiana district even proposed docking salaries for immoral dress. Imagine being a teacher marked unfit because your knees peeked out when you bent to write on the blackboard. Historians still argue whether these working women were truly emancipated or simply trapped in new routines. Did the office job symbolize independence, or just a different form of drudgery? Flappers blurred that line. They worked by day, typed memos, corrected grammar, endured bosses who barked orders. Then by night they shed the grey cardigan, slipped on sequins, and danced until dawn. You watch a typist finish her last letter, slide it into an envelope, and glance at her reflection in the office window. She powders her nose quickly, tucks the compact into her handbag, and with a conspiratorial grin, heads straight for a dance hall. Her wages may be modest, but they're hers, and she spends them how she pleases. Of course, older generations fretted. Mothers muttered that a daughter with a paycheck might never marry, and fathers grumbled that independence would spoil her character. Ministers warned that young women who lived alone in boarding houses were ripe for sin. Yet the reality was simpler. These women paid their own rent, their own grocery bills, and their own cab fare to the speakeasy. Independence was written not in manifestos, but in receipts. One joke around the office went, "A flapper isn't afraid of work, she's afraid of being bored." And you can almost hear the truth in that quip. Work was a ticket to more life, not the end of it. You leave the office behind and wander into a classroom, chalk dust floating in the afternoon sun. At the front, a young teacher in a cloche hat adjusts her skirt and launches into a lesson with brisk authority. Students whisper that she goes dancing on weekends. The principal disapproves, but her students listen raptly anyway. Respect doesn't come from appearances, it comes from presence. By the time the school bell rings and the last typewriter clatters to a stop, you realize something vital. The flapper isn't only a nightclub vision, she's a working woman who signs her own pay stub. Every paycheck is a declaration. I am here, I earn, I decide. And that, more than a short skirt or a cigarette, is what rattled traditional America most. The office lights fade, the school bell rings, and the city exhales into night again. This time, though, the thrill isn't in a speakeasy or on a Charleston floor. It's on a quiet porch, or in the back seat of a car parked just beyond town. You pause by a tree-lined lane and hear giggles, the murmur of voices, and then, well, let's just call it what the newspapers called it, a petting party. A mainstream historical fact. By the mid-1920s, the phrase petting party was on everyone's lips. It referred to informal gatherings where young people experimented with kissing and cuddling in groups, often with alcohol and jazz records spinning in the background. The term horrified parents who had been raised on supervised courtship but thrilled a generation that suddenly had cars, dance halls and freedom. Here's your quirky tidbit. One etiquette expert insisted that a girl could kiss no more than twice in an evening before she risked her reputation. Imagine someone standing on a porch with a stopwatch, timing smooches like Olympic events. Historians still argue whether petting parties marked a genuine sexual revolution or were simply exaggerated by panicked newspapers. Did young people actually cross boundaries, or did the press inflate mild kissing into moral collapse? As usual, the truth probably falls somewhere between, neither as innocent as the elders wished, nor as scandalous as the tabloids claimed. You walk past a porch swing and see a boy leaning closer, a girl adjusting her cloche hat with mock seriousness. They laugh, kiss and pull apart, whispering about parents who would faint if they knew. The air smells of honeysuckle, the shadows of maple leaves dance overhead, and you realize the setting could belong to any century. What's new is the lack of chaperones and the boldness of a girl who decides for herself how far to go. The car, of course, transforms the ritual. Parked on country roads or city outskirts, couples find privacy unthinkable just a decade before. No lace-curtained parlour, no mothers knitting in the corner, just upholstery, moonlight, and a radio crooning jazz. Parents call automobiles rolling bedrooms, convinced their children are barreling straight toward ruin. The panic is almost comic. Newspapers publish warnings that kissing spreads tuberculosis. Ministers declare that petting parties will shatter the moral backbone of youth. One preacher even compared parked cars to portable dens of vice. You imagine a row of Fords lined up in hell, demons tapping at the windows while flappers laugh inside. Yet the young people themselves are far less apocalyptic. For them, the new rituals aren't about destruction, they're about discovery. They're about testing boundaries, about finding romance without an audience, about claiming a sliver of autonomy in a world that still tried to script every move. You catch one flapper's smirk as she climbs back into the passenger seat, her lipstick slightly smudged. She doesn't look ruined. She looks alive, confident, maybe even amused at how terrified her elders would be if they saw her now. As the car engine coughs to life and the couple disappears into the night, you understand why petting parties became symbols of fear. They weren't just about kissing. They were about control, slipping away, one porch swing and one smudge of rouge at a time. You leave the moonlit porches and quiet cars behind, only to step into a kitchen where the light of a single lamp burns late into the night. A mother sits at the table, her hands folded around a teacup gone cold, her eyes darting toward the clock. Her daughter hasn't come home yet, and the sound of distant jazz still drifts faintly from across town. Here, in this hushed room, you see another side of the story, the despair of mothers who felt their daughters were slipping away. A mainstream historical fact, generational conflict in the 1920s was stark. Parents raised in the Victorian or Edwardian eras had grown up with strict gender roles, clear moral codes, and rigid routines. They believed daughters should guard chastity, prepare for marriage, and uphold family reputation. The flappers' independence, working, drinking, dating freely, struck them as catastrophic. Letters to advice columns from the time show mothers pleading for ways to rescue girls from bobbed hair, lipstick, and late nights. Here's your quirky tidbit. One women's club in Ohio actually staged anti-flapper classes where mothers practiced scolding techniques to deliver at home. Imagine a support group where the homework was yelling about knees and rouge more effectively. Historians still argue whether Mother's despair was rooted more in moral conviction or in fear of losing authority. Were they truly worried about souls, or simply about no longer being the keepers of tradition? Whatever the case, the sight of a daughter sneaking out in sequins left many women feeling powerless in their own kitchens. You sit quietly as the mother sighs, clutching a worn photograph of herself at the same age. She remembers when modesty meant pride, when reputation was everything. She wonders if her daughter will ever marry respectably, or if she'll end up ruined. The kettle whistles softly in the background, but she doesn't move. She's listening for the creak of the front door. Meanwhile, the daughter is out laughing, lipstick shining in dim light, her shoes tapping to a trumpet's rhythm. For her, this isn't betrayal, it's life. Yet the clash between them builds like a slow drumbeat. Some mothers tried compromise. They allowed short hair but forbade lipstick. They tolerated dances but demanded church on Sundays. Others clamped down harder, locking doors and issuing ultimatums. Both approaches often failed. The flapper spirit wasn't something you could scold away. And yet, beneath the despair, there's love. These mothers weren't villains. They were women raised in a different script, bewildered that the lines had been rewritten so quickly. To watch a daughter embrace a world you don't understand is to feel both pride and grief. One flapper later recalled how her mother burst into tears when she came home with bobbed hair. It wasn't the haircut she mourned, the daughter said. It was the daughter she thought she'd lost. You feel the ache in that statement. The kitchen clock ticks past midnight, the mother's eyes heavy with worry, while her daughter dances beneath a haze of cigarette smoke miles away. Both are part of the same story, bound by love, yet separated by a cultural chasm. And in that gap, you see why flappers terrified traditional America most of all, because they weren't just strangers in the street. They were daughters at the dinner table. You step out of that dim kitchen and into a wooden church, where the air is thick with incense and indignation. The pews creak as parishioners shift uncomfortably, waiting for the sermon to begin. The minister climbs into the pulpit, face flushed, Bible raised, and his voice booms across the rafters. "This generation is dancing itself to hell." You sit back, half expecting smoke to rise from the floorboards as he slams down each word. A mainstream historical fact. Religious leaders across America waged open war against the flapper. They condemned short skirts, lipstick, and jazz as signs of moral collapse. Entire sermons were dedicated to warning parents that their daughters were one Charleston kick away from eternal damnation. Clergy, who once preached against gambling and drinking, suddenly added rouge and bobbed hair to their list of sins. Here's your quirky tidbit. One church in the Midwest actually passed out pamphlets listing forbidden dances. The Charleston, the Black Bottom, and the Shimmy all made the cut. Oddly enough, the pamphlet included step diagrams so members could recognize these sinful moves, ensuring that even the most sheltered parishioner could accidentally learn them. Imagine teenagers studying the diagram like homework, then practicing the very steps in the barn later that night. Historians still argue whether these religious outcries reflected genuine spiritual panic or strategic showmanship. Did preachers truly fear damnation, or did they seize the flapper as a convenient villain to rally congregations? Either way, the sight of young women painting their faces and dancing on Sundays gave ministers a ready-made sermon illustration. You glance around the church. Mothers nod grimly, fathers clear their throats in agreement, but you notice the younger congregants smirking into their hymnals. They've already been to a dance hall. They know exactly what the minister is railing against. The words thunder, but the beat of jazz still echoes in their minds, drowning out the fire and brimstone. One preacher shouted that rouge was Satan's paintbrush and bobbed hair was an insult to God's design. Another warned that speakeasies were gateways to perdition, even as city policemen accepted bribes to look the other way. The hypocrisy wasn't lost on the flappers, who often joked that ministers just needed a good Charleston to loosen up. The clash spills beyond the pulpit. Religious organizations pushed for stricter blue laws, bans on dances, and curfews for young women. In some towns, police actually arrested couples for improper conduct if caught kissing on park benches. It was morality enforced with handcuffs, though the effect was often more comic than controlling. You sit in the pew, half listening as the minister's voice rises, face red with fury. He insists civilization teeters on the edge, that lipstick is the mark of rebellion, that daughters are slipping away like sand through a sieve. And maybe he's right, civilization is changing. But as you look at the row of young women whispering and stifling laughter, you know his warnings aren't working. The sermon ends, the hymn drifts softly, and the congregation files out into the sunshine. The mothers leave reassured, the fathers mutter about discipline, but the daughters glance at one another, their eyes gleaming with secret plans. Tonight, there's another dance, and hellfire or not, they'll be there. You leave the church behind, the minister's thunder still rattling in your ears, and wander into a dusty town square where a different sort of sermon is being shouted. Men in robes and hoods march in step, their torches crackling in the night. It's the Ku Klux Klan, revived in the 1920s and now claiming not just to defend racial purity, but also the sanctity of morals against modern corruption. And yes, the flapper becomes one of their chosen enemies. A mainstream historical fact. The Klan's second rise in the 1920s wasn't limited to racial hatred. It also pitched itself as the guardian of traditional values. They opposed alcohol, jazz, Catholics, immigrants, and yes, women who bobbed their hair and danced the Charleston. In some states, Klan members paraded down main streets with banners warning that America was crumbling under jazz and gin. Here's your quirky tidbit. One Klan rally in Indiana staged a mock trial of the flapper. Men in robes set up a fake courtroom, accusing a young woman of crimes like short skirts and excessive lipstick. She was symbolically condemned to represent the downfall of morality. You imagine the absurd theatre of it all, hooded men terrified not of bullets but of rouge. Historians still argue whether the Klan genuinely feared flappers or simply used them as convenient scapegoats to stoke outrage. Some scholars say it was a way to recruit anxious parents, especially mothers, by promising to protect their daughters from modern corruption. Others suggest the Klan simply hated anything new, be it jazz, immigrants, or women's independence. You stand at the edge of the rally, the torchlight flickering across faces both stern and frightened. They shout that the nation is under attack, that the flapper is a symbol of moral decay, that America must return to an imaginary golden age of obedience and purity. It's the same fear you heard in the church, only louder, uglier, and cloaked in violence. But even here, irony sneaks in. Reports from the Time note that some daughters of Klan members snuck off to dances anyway, bobbed their hair in secret, and returned home late, their perfume lingering. The very rebellion the Klan tried to crush seeped into its own households, proving that no hood or torch could stop a trend carried on the laughter of youth. One joke in the cities went, "What's scarier than a man in a white hood, a girl in a red dress?" The humour stung because it carried truth. The flapper's power wasn't in violence, but in defiance, in refusing to be controlled by sermons, hoods, or laws. You turn away from the torches and listen instead to the faint echo of jazz drifting from a nearby barn dance. That's where the real revolution is happening. Not in marches of fear, but in the stubborn joy of young women who refuse to be told no. And as you walk away, you realize something. The louder the backlash, the more terrified traditional America truly was. You walk away from the torchlit square and stumble into daylight, where the clamor is no less fierce, only now it's about fabric. On a crowded city street, a police officer stops a group of laughing young women, his eyes narrowing at the hems of their dresses. Out comes a tape measure, and suddenly the absurdity of the moment hits you. He's measuring knees. Welcome to the Fashion Police 1920s edition. A mainstream historical fact: in many towns and cities, officials tried to legislate women's clothing. Decency ordinances dictated how short skirts could be, how low necklines could dip, even how sheer stockings could appear. In Washington, D.C., women were actually arrested at pools and beaches if their bathing suits exposed more than 6 inches above the knee. These arrests made headlines, with embarrassed young women standing in court while reporters scribbled eagerly. Here's your quirky tidbit. In Chicago, one group of officers carried rulers specifically for swimsuit inspections. Newspapers dubbed them the knee police. Imagine an officer crouching on hot sand with a ruler while flappers giggled and adjusted their straps just out of reach. Comedy meet patriarchy. Historians still argue whether these laws were genuinely about morality or simply about control. Were communities truly scandalized by knees, or were officials flexing power in the only way they could against women who refused to obey? The debate lingers, but as you watch a policeman measure hems, you sense that the spectacle mattered more than the skirts. The crackdowns didn't stop at beaches. Some cities banned public dancing if dresses were deemed too revealing. Others fined women for public indecency when they wore sleeveless tops. Fashion became a battlefield, with every exposed inch sparking outrage. And yet, the rebellion only spread. For every fine, a dozen more flappers shortened their skirts. For every arrest, magazines ran photographs of stylish women smirking at the camera, daring others to copy them. The attempt to shame ended up glamorizing instead. One flapper recalled being hauled into court for her swimsuit, only to have the judge dismiss the case while chuckling. "He told me I looked too healthy to be indecent," she said later, laughing at the memory. The irony is rich. While men strutted in public with shirt collars open and cigars clenched between their teeth, women were treated like criminals for showing calves. But every arrest, every photograph, every indignant headline pushed the flapper deeper into the spotlight. You walk past the officer and watch the young women stride away, skirts swishing, laughter trailing behind them. They don't look cowed, they look amused. Knees, of all things, had become a cultural battlefield, and the flapper was winning by simply walking down the street. As the crowd disperses, you realize the futility of the fashion police. Tradition might wield rulers, fines, and moral panic, but the hemline will keep rising, and every inch of exposed knee is another inch of freedom no ruler can measure away. You drift from the noisy street into a cavernous department store where the air smells of polished wood, perfume samples, and fresh silk. Elevators glide open, shoe clerks bustle, and a dizzying array of dresses sparkle under bright electric lights. This isn't just a store, it's a palace of temptation, and the flapper is its queen. A mainstream historical fact, the 1920s saw department stores explode into cultural landmarks. Chains like Macy's, Marshall Field's, and Wanamaker's expanded into dazzling emporiums, offering not just goods, but experiences, tea rooms, fashion shows, beauty counters. Women, especially young working women, became the prime targets of this consumer revolution. Their paychecks fed directly into racks of beaded dresses and counters lined with rouge. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some stores installed lipstick rooms where women could try new shades before buying, an idea scandalous enough that etiquette experts called them corridors of corruption. Imagine a sales clerk whispering, "This one's called Flirtation Red," while matrons in the corner pretended not to faint. Historians still argue whether consumerism was empowering or exploitative. Did department stores give flappers access to tools of self-expression, or did they cleverly market rebellion in ways that funneled profits to male-owned companies? Was the flapper a feminist figure or a customer carefully engineered by advertising executives? You stroll past mannequins wearing cloche hats tilted just so, their painted faces eerily mimicking the real flappers you saw in speakeasies. Every display whispers, "You too can be modern. You too can be daring." The message is subtle but relentless. Buying isn't just shopping, it's belonging. Credit systems make it even easier. Stores offered installment plans, so a girl could walk out with silk stockings today and pay in nickels later. For a young typist earning modest wages, that was liberation wrapped in tissue paper. Suddenly, style wasn't confined to the rich. It spread to anyone bold enough to sign on the dotted line. And the cosmetics counters, rows of powder compacts gleam like treasure, bottles of perfume glisten under mirrored lights, and young women line up to dab and sniff. A salesgirl in crisp uniform demonstrates the new look on a customer who giggles nervously as rouge brightens her cheeks. Just a few feet away, a mother whispers that such things make girls look cheap. The daughter buys it anyway. One witty columnist quipped that department stores were the cathedrals of the flapper. It's not hard to see why. Here, rebellion is displayed on hangers and glass shelves, neatly folded and ready to take home. You pause at the shoe department, where rows of shiny Mary Janes and T-straps beckon. A clerk kneels, slides a pair onto a young woman's feet, and she beams as if Cinderella's slipper just found her. It isn't magic, it's marketing. But to her, it feels like freedom. By the time you step back out into the sunlight, packages rustling under your arm, you realize what terrifies traditional America most. It isn't just that women are changing, it's that the entire commercial world is cheering them on, selling rebellion in boxes tied with ribbon. Knees and rouge may have been shocking, but nothing unsettled the old guard more than realizing you could buy them right off the shelf. You step away from the glittering shop windows and into a quiet cafe where the clatter of coffee cups competes with the rustle of newspapers. Headlines scream about crime, jazz, and scandal, but tucked deeper inside are the voices of the cultural referees, the columnists. Ink-stained and opinionated, they serve as both critics and comedians, skewering the flapper with equal parts mockery and alarm. A mainstream historical fact. Newspapers and magazines of the 1920s devoted endless ink to the flapper phenomenon. Humorists like Ring Lardner and H. L. Mencken joked about the modern girl, while more conservative writers scolded her. Cartoons often showed bob-haired women smoking with one hand and tugging skirts upward with the other, while befuddled fathers fainted in the background. The flapper wasn't just a woman. She was a punchline and a headline rolled into one. Here's your quirky tidbit. One syndicated humor column described flappers as little machines made of rouge, gin, and knees. Another warned men to beware of the girl who knows more about cocktails than casseroles. You picture these articles read aloud in kitchens, fathers chuckling nervously while daughters rolled their eyes. Historians still argue whether this satire reinforced the flapper as a cultural menace or actually helped normalize her. Did the jokes diminish her influence, or did constant exposure make her seem inevitable? After all, if everyone is laughing about flappers, doesn't that mean everyone is talking about them too? You sip your coffee and glance around the cafe. At one table, an old man in suspenders mutters over an editorial warning that the flapper is America's downfall. At another, two young women giggle over a cartoon showing a bob-haired girl out drinking her date. Criticism and celebration blur together until it's hard to tell whether the mockery is meant to sting or to secretly advertise. Even highbrow writers couldn't resist. Mencken described flappers as the emancipated woman on parade, both mocking and admiring their audacity. Some columnists compared them to wild animals, exotic, unpredictable, dangerous. Others dismissed them as shallow, insisting that beneath the powder and fringe was nothing but vanity. And yet, the ink never stopped flowing. Week after week, the flapper filled columns, cartoons, and covers. If she were truly insignificant, would so many pens be sharpened against her? You realize the constant critique did more than condemn. It kept her in the spotlight, ensuring she stayed impossible to ignore. One flapper later quipped that she never needed a mirror because the newspapers described her outfit every morning. It was a joke, but it held a truth. Ridicule and attention were two sides of the same coin, and both gave her power. As you fold the newspaper and place it back on the counter, you see clearly why traditional America was unnerved. Every column, whether mocking or mourning, admitted the same thing. The flapper had arrived, and she wasn't leaving the page any time soon. You leave the cafe and wander into a dim little bookstore, the scent of ink and paper thick in the air. Shelves sag under novels, pamphlets, and journals, and tucked between the sensational headlines lies a quieter but sharper defense of the flapper. Here, intellectuals and feminists sharpen their pens, arguing not that the flapper is frivolous, but that she is a symbol, messy, imperfect, but important. A mainstream historical fact. Writers like F. Scott Fitzgerald didn't just observe the flapper, they canonized her. In stories like Bernice Bobs Her Hair and novels like This Side of Paradise, Fitzgerald captured her as witty, daring, and dangerously magnetic. Dorothy Parker, with her razor wit, skewered and celebrated modern women in equal measure. These weren't lectures from pulpits, they were arguments dressed in prose, slipped into libraries and parlors, shaping how Americans thought about youth itself. And here's your quirky tidbit. In 1922, the New Republic published an essay defending flappers as pioneers of a new morality. The author compared short skirts and cigarettes to battle flags, suggesting that bobbed hair was as radical as any political act. Imagine an academic footnote to Rouge. Historians still argue whether these defenses were genuine endorsements of women's independence or just romanticized portraits crafted by men who found flappers intoxicating. Was Fitzgerald celebrating liberation or exploiting it for drama and sales? Feminist critics continue to debate whether the flapper was truly free or still trapped in society's gaze. You browse the shelves and find slim paperbacks with titles like The Modern Girl and The Revolt of Youth. Some are earnest, calling for a world where women shape their destinies. Others are playful, almost cheeky, suggesting that a bobbed haircut is a declaration of independence worth more than any political rally. In smoky lecture halls, professors debated whether flappers were signs of decadence or agents of progress. In living rooms, daughters waved these essays in their mothers' faces, insisting they had scholarship on their side. Every argument, every witty line in a magazine carved another crack in the wall of tradition. Of course, not all defenses were flattering. Some feminists sighed that flappers wasted energy on fashion instead of politics. They wanted votes, not vanity, laws, not lipstick. Yet others countered that lipstick and laws weren't mutually exclusive, that sometimes rebellion begins in the mirror before it marches into the voting booth. One flapper later wrote in her diary, "They tell me I am shallow. Perhaps, but shallow water still makes ripples." That line sticks with you because it captures what the intellectual defenses understood. The flapper wasn't perfect, but she mattered. You close the book in your hands and feel the weight of it, heavier than sequins or fringe. In words, in debates, in essays tucked into journals, the flapper became more than a scandal. She became an idea. and ideas are harder to silence than knees or rouge. You step out of the bookstore into the brisk evening, and your thoughts linger on the debates you've just overheard in ink and paper. The flapper wasn't just a girl in sequins anymore. She was a puzzle, a riddle that scholars and social critics couldn't stop picking apart. Even now, historians still tilt their heads and ask, was she a feminist icon or just a consumer product dressed up in beads? A mainstream historical fact, the 1920s flapper has been studied for a century, her image dissected in classrooms and conferences. Some argue she represented the first wave of true sexual and social liberation, paving the way for later feminist movements. Others say she was mostly a media construction, Hollywood, department stores and ad agencies, feeding rebellion in order to sell rouge, records and rayon dresses. Here's your quirky tidbit. In the 1960s, when historians revisited the flapper, one actually called her the best-dressed puppet capitalism ever dangled. Another historian shot back that calling her a puppet ignored the fact that real women bobbed their hair and shocked their mothers long before Macy's printed an ad. The argument got so heated that one conference jokingly suggested a Charleston contest to settle it. Imagine professors in tweed jackets trying to kick their way to consensus. The debate lingers because the flapper's contradictions are baked into her very existence. She smoked, drank, and danced, but she also bought those cigarettes, cocktails, and dresses from industries eager to cash in. She worked in offices and classrooms, but often still faced unequal pay and limited career paths. She was modern, bold, and free, but only within the boundaries her wallet or social class allowed. You walk past a cafe where students are still arguing over her meaning. One insists she was a revolutionary, a proto-feminist, who claimed ownership of her body and choices. Another counters that she was a distraction, a shiny decoy that kept women busy with fashion while men still ran the world. And maybe both are right. What's undeniable is how much fear she provoked. Traditional America saw in her a threat far greater than rouge or knees. She represented unpredictability. If daughters could cut their hair, smoke in public, and choose their lovers, what else might they choose next? Careers? Politics? Lives untethered from the script of marriage and motherhood? That uncertainty rattled the old world more than any jazz riff ever could. You smile, remembering a flapper's diary entry you stumbled across once. If I am an advertisement, then I am advertising myself. Perhaps that's the neatest answer to the scholarly debate. Whether feminist or consumer product, she turned herself into her own billboard, living proof that the old rules could be broken and life could be written in lipstick instead of ink. As you keep walking, you realize the real terror of the flapper wasn't that she fit neatly into one category, it was that she didn't. She refused to be pinned down, measured, or defined, an enigma with bobbed hair, and a knowing grin still laughing at us a century later. You walk into a crowded brokerage office, the tick-tick-tick of the ticker-tape machine filling the air like a mechanical heartbeat. Clerks shout numbers, men in suspenders chew cigars, and in the corner a young woman in a cloche hat leans casually against the wall, laughing with her friends. Even here, in the temple of finance, the flapper makes her presence felt. But as the tape keeps spitting out numbers, a shadow lurks behind the glitter. The crash is coming. A mainstream historical fact, by the late 1920s, the American stock market ballooned with speculation. People borrowed heavily to buy stocks on margin, hoping prices would rise forever. The culture of the flapper, carefree spending, champagne parties, endless nights, seemed to sync perfectly with the mood of the market, high, giddy, unstoppable. Yet beneath the music, the floorboards creaked. In October 1929, the crash struck, wiping away fortunes and ending the jazz age overnight. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some flappers were photographed in brokerage offices, perched on ticker machines, as though they were just another dance floor. Newspapers joked about Charleston's on Wall Street. The image is absurd but haunting, legs kicking while the market teetered on collapse. Historians still argue whether the crash truly ended the flapper or whether she was already fading. Was the stock market collapse the guillotine that killed her, or had the image become a parody of itself by the late 20s? The debate lingers, like the last notes of a song fading while the lights flicker. You can picture it vividly. A Saturday night in 1928, champagne flowing, music blaring, flappers clinking glasses with brokers flush with easy money. They laugh, they spend, they dance until dawn. Then, only a year later, those same champagne bottles gather dust in shuttered clubs, beads pawned for pennies, lipstick tubes rolling across empty apartment floors. Traditional America, watching from the sidelines, almost smirks. Preachers say, "Well, we told you so." Mothers sigh that frivolity brought ruin. Fathers nod grimly, insisting the old ways were safer. But the truth is harsher. The crash crushed everyone, flapper and father alike. The rebellion may have frightened traditionalists, but the market reminded everyone that no joyride lasts forever. You step outside onto Wall Street itself, where autumn leaves swirl between the granite towers. It's eerily quiet now, but you can still feel the ghost of that giddy energy, the laughter, the arrogance, the sense that the music would never stop. The flapper lived for the moment, and the crash proved just how fragile the moment could be. And yet, even here, her spirit lingers. The crash may have emptied her glass, but it didn't erase her image. She still terrifies traditional America, not just because she danced while the market swelled, but because even now she's remembered for living vividly while others worried themselves into grey. You drift away from Wall Street's echoing silence and find yourself in a parlour that feels strangely subdued. The beads and fringe are gone, the music replaced by the drone of a radio announcer speaking about unemployment lines and bread rations. The year is 1931 and the mood has shifted. Where once a flapper might have danced until dawn, now she scans the classifieds, her sequined dress traded for a simple cotton frock. The flapper hasn't vanished entirely, but she has faded into memory. A mainstream historical fact, the Great Depression crushed the exuberance of the 1920s. By 1933, nearly 25% of Americans were unemployed, fortunes were wiped out, and frivolity seemed like a cruel luxury. The extravagant flapper lifestyle, champagne, fringe, and Charleston felt out of step with the grim realities of soup kitchens and dust storms. Here's your quirky tidbit. Thrift magazines of the early 1930s ran features on how to recycle flapper dresses. Suggestions included removing fringe for curtains or repurposing beads for embroidery. Imagine the once scandalous knee-skimming dress cut down into kitchen aprons, rebellion stitched back into domesticity. Historians still argue whether the Depression killed the flapper or simply transformed her. Some insist she disappeared entirely, a relic of a decadent age. Others argue that the spirit of independence lingered, re-emerging later in new forms. Women in the workforce during World War II, for instance, or the bold styles of the 1960s. You picture one woman, once the life of the dance hall, now stirring a pot of soup, her rouge compact tucked in a drawer. She sighs at the memory of speakeasies, yet when her daughter asks about the 1920s, her eyes light up. She describes the music, the laughter, the feeling of flying free. Even in hard times, the memory is a lifeline. Traditional America feels vindicated. Ministers point to empty dance halls and declare victory. Politicians insist the old values will save the nation. Yet beneath the surface, the flapper remains, if only in whispers. She exists in the way women still bob their hair, still wear lipstick, still insist on working for themselves even when wages are scarce. One elderly critic of the time admitted begrudgingly, "We thought she was gone, but she left her mark. Even in poverty, women are not what they once were." That confession is the quiet victory of the flapper. She didn't need sequins to survive. She had already rewritten the script. You sit in the parlor, radio humming, children playing on the floor. Outside, the world groans under economic collapse. Inside, you can almost hear the faint echo of jazz. The flapper is fading, yes, but not erased. She lingers like perfume in a scarf tucked away in a drawer, fainter each year but impossible to wash out completely. You step into a movie theatre again, but the screen looks different now. Instead of silent reels flickering with Clara Bow's grin, you hear the steady chatter of a talkie, the voices sharp and clear. The year is later now, the flapper's sequins long since dulled, but her ghost still drifts across the silver screen. Hollywood hasn't let her go. If anything, it has embalmed her in glamour. A mainstream historical fact. Even after the Depression dimmed her real-world presence, the flapper lived on in popular culture. Films, novels, and fashion spreads kept her image alive. Short skirts, bobbed hair, red lips. In later decades, designers revived her look again and again. In the 1960s with Twiggy's shift dresses, in the 1980s with sequined party frocks, even now in Halloween costumes that reduce her rebellion to feathers and fringe. Here's your quirky tidbit. In the 1950s, a nostalgic revival of Charleston dance contests swept some nightclubs, with grandmothers showing off steps they'd once performed as flappers. Imagine a grey-haired woman kicking up her heels, beads rattling faintly, while her grandchildren gawk in disbelief. Historians still argue whether the flapper deserves the title of cultural icon or cautionary tale. Was she the first glimpse of modern womanhood, or just a frivolous fad? Either way, the fact she's still being debated a century later answers the question in its own way. She mattered, if not as she intended, then as a symbol larger than herself. You stroll down a modern street and notice echoes everywhere. A girl in leggings struts with headphones in, hair cropped short, lipstick bold. She may not call herself a flapper, but she owes something to those women who first smoked in public, first drove their own cars, first kicked up their knees without waiting for permission. Traditional America once trembled at the sight of a girl with a cigarette and a laugh, too loud. Now that same image hangs in art prints, fashion spreads, and retro party invitations. What once terrified has become aesthetic. That's the flapper's final joke. Her rebellion, once scandalous, now sells cocktails at themed bars. And yet the legacy runs deeper. She cracked the shell of expectation, even if only slightly, and showed that women could terrify simply by choosing joy. That terror never fully fades, it just changes costumes. The lights dim, the reel sputters, and the screen fades to black. You lean back in your seat, letting the last echoes of jazz fade into silence. Now, as the story of the flapper settles, you feel the pace of the night ease, the noise of jazz and laughter drifting further into the distance. The smoke clears, the sequins fall quiet, and all that remains is the gentle hush of memory. The knees that once shocked small towns are now tucked under blankets. The laughter that once rattled ministers is just a soft whisper carried by time. Breathe a little slower now. Let your shoulders drop. Picture a city at rest, the speakeasies shuttered, the dance floors empty, the bobbed hair tucked under soft scarves as women lean against pillows. The fear, the fury, the joy of the 1920s has ebbed into the stillness of history. Imagine the streets you've walked tonight, empty sidewalks glistening with rain, neon signs blinking out one by one, a last streetcar rattling down a quiet track. The city exhales, the countryside sleeps, and the flapper's ghost sways gently like a candle flame, neither frightening nor flamboyant anymore, just peaceful. You've traced her journey from the wild nights of jazz to the fading glow of memory. You've seen how every hemline and every laugh shook the old world. But now the world is hushed, and so are you. Let the noise fade. Let the imagery soften into sepia, like an old photograph tucked away in a drawer. Somewhere, faint music still plays, but it's slow now, dreamy, like a lullaby played on a distant gramophone. Close your eyes, breathe deeper, and let yourself drift as the flapper's dance becomes nothing more than a ripple in history, a whisper of freedom. The night is quiet now, the story is complete. Sleep waits just around the corner.